The drought-stricken Colorado River is in critical condition, triggering cuts to water supplies in the Southwest. Today, the river remains unsustainably low.
They flooded a place that had been dry for millions of years, and they did it on purpose. Hidden behind a massive concrete wall, an old riverbed sat silent, while engineers and scientists planned a risky test. When they finally opened the gates, water rushed into a canyon that barely remembered it. But this wasn't just about turning the river back on. It was about something in the sand, something buried in the walls.
It exposes archaeological sites, eliminates habitat for birds and wildlife, and it eliminates beaches for our river rafters.
And a choice that still shapes the Colorado River today. So what exactly did they set in motion? The riverbed's silent past. For millions of years, a river carved its way through a vast canyon, shaping stone and sediment with relentless force. But the channel that once carried this ancient flow eventually fell silent, drying into a landscape buried beneath dust and heat. This was no ordinary dry riverbed. It was a place molded by natural floods, sediment movement, and erosion over an unimaginable span of time, its secrets locked beneath cracked earth. Then, for the first time in ages, engineers released a massive surge of water into the long, dry channel. No one knew how the canyon would react to such a sudden, powerful return of flow. Before this event, water had not touched the riverbed for millions of years. The processes that once sculpted it, flooding, sediment deposition, erosion, had been dormant for an immense length of time. When water finally returned, the experiment became far more meaningful than a dramatic flood. It raised questions about nature's resilience and about the consequences of interrupting and then reawakening a system that had evolved over eons. The riverbed was no longer a static relic. It was a stage set for transformation. The Grand Canyon, famed for its immense scale and multi-layered geologic history, hides a fragile environment dependent on water's steady presence. When engineers opened the dam's giant tubes, it became clear how intimately the river and canyon were connected. Sand, silt, and rock that had settled for decades were suddenly lifted and swept downstream. The river rose 16 feet, an unmistakable sign that this ancient channel still had life to give. The flood did more than move sediment. It reactivated dormant ecosystems and disrupted invasive plants that had colonized the dry corridor. Water brought new energy into the canyon, but it also raised uncertainty. Could the canyon withstand such force after so many still years? And how long could this revival last, under the constraints of human control upstream? As hundreds of thousands of gallons surged through the canyon every second, the flood exposed a fragile tension between natural rhythms and artificial manipulation. The once silent riverbed was more than a forgotten landscape. It was a warning. Beneath its surface lay a delicate balance already disrupted by decades of damming. Understanding that balance would become vital to any future restoration. The scale of the flood was astonishing. In under 20 minutes, enough water passed through to fill the Empire State Building. This was the largest man-made flood in U.S. history, yet the long-term impact remained uncertain. Could such a massive release undo decades of sediment starvation, or was it only a fleeting glimpse of what the river once was? Before the flood, the canyon's identity centered on heat, rock, and immensity, features that appeared timeless. The sudden return of water brought motion, instability, and possibility. An ancient riverbed became alive again, but in conditions far removed from the natural cycles that once sustained it. Each ripple and shifting sandbar hinted at both renewal and loss. That first flood was dramatic, but it marked only the beginning. The dry riverbed might no longer be silent, yet its revived voice carried both hope and fragility. The consequences of reintroducing water would unfold slowly, shaping a longer cultural and environmental story still being written. The complexity of the river system and its human alterations soon became impossible to ignore, drawing attention to the role of damming and water management in shaping the river's fate. Soon became Glen Canyon Dam's arrival. In 1963, the course of the Colorado River was fundamentally altered by a colossal human-made structure. The Glen Canyon Dam, rising 720 feet tall and stretching 1,600 feet wide, the dam blocked about 186 miles of the river's channel in northern Arizona. It created Lake Powell, America's second-largest reservoir, and became a symbol of engineering triumph, but also environmental transformation. Upstream from the Grand Canyon by just 15 miles, this dam would set in motion changes that would ripple through the ecosystem for decades. The dam was built by the Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency responsible for water management and dam construction across the arid American West. Its purpose was to control the river's flow to generate hydroelectric power, provide water for irrigation, and prevent floods. While it achieved these goals, it also disrupted the natural rhythms of the Colorado River, which had followed seasonal floods and droughts for millions of years. Blocking the river's flow meant trapping sediment behind the dam, a crucial material the river used to build and sustain beaches and sandbars downstream. Before the Glen Canyon Dam, the Colorado River was a mighty force, carrying millions of tons of fine sand and silt from the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Gulf of California. This carried not only sediment, but nutrients and habitat foundations that supported diverse plant and animal life. After the dam's completion, however, 90% of that sediment was trapped in Lake Powell downstream. The Grand Canyon's beaches and sandbars began shrinking, vanishing year after year. The steady loss of these sands disrupted everything from riverbank vegetation to fish habitats. One particularly visible impact was on the native vegetation along the riverbanks. Plants like mesquite trees, once close to the water's edge, began dying as the water retreated. At the same time, invasive species such as tamarisk and camelthorn rapidly spread in the changed environment. The controlling of water flow transformed the once vibrant and dynamic river corridor into something less familiar. A green ribbon punctuated by beaches that slowly disappeared and rocky channels that grew broader and more barren. Initially, the river's powerful floods, which every summer, in a very natural way, reshaped the canyon, had been replaced by gradual flows that were controlled by turbine usage and power demands. Consequently, the river's natural pulse was now dully artificial, and the natural cycles that had been sustaining beach building and ecological balance for thousands of years were sacrificed. The consequences got very painfully clear to river guides and scientists who watched and measured the shrinking beaches and changing habitats, and by these means were able to get the first-hand experience of the consequences. Building the dam was a paradox that gave and took. On the same hand, it was a cause for human advance, and at the same time, a trigger for ecological decline that very much characterized the debate about water management in the West. The dam's disadvantages were somehow forced upon the environment, while water use and energy production were the main concerns in making such difficult choices. The deepening tension between man and nature lasted for several decades. Scientists started to realize that nature was not only declining through the reduction of vegetation and beaches, fish deaths, excavations along the riverbanks being swept away, and the changing of the terrains where wild animals lived were all signs of decline. The natural world, which had been evolving for millions of years, was now trapped in a new era, dictated by the construction of concrete walls and the manipulation of water release. However, only in the mid-1990s did both engineers and environmentalists turn to the new methods for the restoration of the lost lands. They were looking for a good point at which to harness the advantages of the dam and the needs of the river below it at the same time. As it turned out, the first chance at this would be an extraordinary experiment that would leave those who experienced it shocked and thrilled. This set the stage for the daring scientific experiment that would flood the dry riverbed and turn the flow of the Colorado River back toward its ancient rhythms, at least temporarily. of the first flood experiment. In the early morning of March 26, 1996, engineers at Glen Canyon Dam began an unprecedented act. They opened 4 giant pipes called jet tubes that released water at volumes never before intentionally directed downstream. Starting at 6:20 a.m., water surged out at an initial rate of 264,000 gallons per second, eventually rising to 335,000 gallons per second as turbines were turned on. This flow was equivalent to emptying an Olympic-sized swimming pool every 2 seconds through the dam. What followed was the first controlled flood in history, lasting nearly a week and reshaping the river and landscape downstream. The scale of this flood was unlike anything the canyon had seen since the natural floods that once swept through before the dam existed. For hours, water roared through the dry and altered riverbed, lifting and redistributing millions of tons of sand, silt, and rock that had been settled for decades. The river rose 16 feet above normal levels, reconnecting with banks and sandbars that had been shrinking for years. It was a moment of renewal, a chance to see if the artificial flood could mimic nature's own restorative power. Early results showed promise. New sandbars began to form as sediment settled in calm backwaters, creating critical habitat areas for fish spawning and wildlife. The 2 largest rapids along the river widened, returning some of the dynamic character lost after damming. Even important archaeological sites on the banks were left unharmed, which was a relief to preservationists who feared flooding could damage ancient remains. Meanwhile, plants that had started reclaiming these dry areas largely survived the flood's force. But not everything was permanent. Once the dam returned to regular operation, much of the newly formed sand was carried downstream and lost over the following months. Researchers learned that the sediment introduced by tributaries only stays in place briefly. Timing was key. Floods had to be carefully coordinated with periods when fresh sediment arrived naturally to maximize their impact. This insight became the foundation for future flood experiments and management strategies. Despite some setbacks, the experiment made it clear that intentional, controlled flooding downstream of the dams could restore parts of the river's natural environment. It proved that sandbars could come back, at least for a time, and that the river could reclaim some of its lost identity under human guidance. The ecological benefits outweighed any concerns, providing hope for long-term restoration efforts. The 1996 flood was a watershed moment, demonstrating that the river's pulse could be restarted and opening new possibilities for managing one of the West's most endangered ecosystems. It also exposed the difficult balance between engineering needs and ecological health, a balance that remains complex and contentious today. Even as the river showed signs of life, the experiment raised deeper questions about how to carefully maintain this artificial rhythm of floods without losing the power and water vital for millions of people. The stage was set for the careful negotiation between nature's ancient flow and modern human demands. This delicate balance continues to shape the ongoing story of the Colorado River and its future ecological changes and challenges. The construction of Glen Canyon Dam brought about some surprising shifts in the ecosystem below the dam, changing the balance between native life and newcomers. For instance, trout, which had never thrived in the warm, muddy waters of the free-flowing river, suddenly found perfect conditions in the cold, clear water released by the dam. Their populations soared, and they became a prominent part of the river's new ecology. At the same time, riverside vegetation began to grow more densely. Yet these changes masked deeper problems developing in the background. The steady, predictable water flow meant that native sandbars and beaches, key habitats for many animals, started to disappear. These areas, once rebuilt every spring by powerful floods, gradually shrank and vanished. Without frequent disturbance by floods, invasive plants like tamarisk, camel thorn, and Bermuda grass took hold, overtaking the open riverbanks. Native species such as the mesquite trees began dying off as the river's edge moved farther away from their roots. River guides who had spent years navigating the canyon witnessed this loss firsthand. Beaches that once offered rest points for rafters diminished, and what remained was dominated by rocky, inhospitable terrain. Small backwater pools, vital for native fish to spawn and feed, disappeared. The river, once a dynamic and shifting environment, became more like a static channel choked with rock and invasive plants. This ecological stagnation posed serious risks not only to wildlife, but also to cultural sites intricately connected with the river's natural rhythms. Scientists studying the river realized that human control had replaced the Colorado River's natural flow regime with predictable but uniform water levels. Unlike the sharp rises and falls shaped by seasonal floods, the steady releases smoothed out the river's pulse, decreasing the natural habitat variety. The loss of powerful flood events eroded complexity from the ecosystem, leaving few opportunities for renewal and growth. This led to widespread agreement that something had to be done to restore the lost dynamism. By the early 1980s, researchers had begun to understand the vital role natural floods played in shaping not only the landscape but also the life it supported. Floods carved out sandbars, washed away invasive plants, and replenished nutrients in the river corridor. Their absence was not a mere inconvenience, but a fundamental disruption. Without floods, the ecosystem's complexity and resilience declined rapidly. The need for innovative solutions became urgent, especially as pressures from growth and drought intensified. However, the advantages of the damming, such as the reliable water supply for the city and the electric power from the dam, could not be sidelined. The dam's water, which was cold and clear, turned out to be a sanctuary for certain fish species and also controlled the riverbanks differently. The birds and mammals changed their habits, and tourism flourished as the area became a green corridor due to climate change. The blending of gains and losses made the management decisions harder, and it was revealed that the different environmental values and human needs were in a sort of juggle. At the same time, the risk of erosion brought up a new problem to tackle. The riverbanks, beaches, and archaeological sites downstream, which were the end of the sediment flow, faced faster wear-out due to wind and water, with less sediment coming down. The sand that used to shield these historical sites was vanishing, thus making the ruins made of fragile materials more likely to be damaged. Each flood event that did not result in sand deposition increased the risk of losing forever the cultural heritage that had been valued so much. The river's diminishing was no more a matter of nature. It was a matter of history and culture as well. The public was more and more insistent on the restoration of beaches and habitats. River guides, environmentalists, and the native population all called for measures that would make the river as vibrant as it used to be. The concern was such that the scientists and engineers got into the subject of water releases controlled in such a manner that the mimicry of natural floods that had been extinct from the area for a long time would occur. The project of controlled floods was to achieve the twin goals of ecological restoration and the realities of dam management. However, the challenges were very difficult from a technical and logistical perspective. The careful calibration of the required water releases for nature support, power generation, and water supplies was no easy task. It was very important to know the natural sediment supply and its movement in the river for the floods to be effective. The careful timing of floods would turn out to be a critical piece in restoring the Colorado's living landscape. The race between sand and water. Restoring the Colorado River's natural habitats has long been hindered by one major problem: the lack of sediment downstream of Glen Canyon Dam. Before the dam was built, millions of tons of sand and silt flowed from tributaries into the main river each year, forming the beaches, sandbars, and protective banks that wildlife depended on. Once the dam trapped most of this material in Lake Powell, Downstream ecosystems were starved of the sediment required to sustain their natural structure. Scientists soon learned that releasing water alone could not rebuild sandbars. Sediment had to be present at the right moment. If a high-flow release occurred before fresh sand arrived from tributaries, the powerful water simply scoured the riverbed clean. If the release came too late, the available sediment had already drifted downstream. Precise timing became essential to ensure sand was in position to be reshaped into bars, beaches, and habitat. Much of this strategy centered on the Paria River, the key tributary supplying sediment to Marble Canyon, the stretch directly below Glen Canyon Dam. By monitoring seasonal storms, snowmelt, and sediment pulses from the Paria, researchers could determine when riverbeds carried enough sand to justify a controlled flood. Tools, such as remote-operated cameras and automated sensors, tracked sandbar growth and erosion in real time, allowing managers to pinpoint the best moment for a high-flow experiment. This approach shifted water management from fixed schedules to an adaptive system that mimics natural timing. Rather than releasing water annually, managers now wait for sediment-rich conditions before initiating a high-flow release. This synchronization respects the natural interplay of water and sediment, greatly increasing the success of artificial floods. During these releases, floodwaters act like a conveyor belt, lifting sand from the riverbed and spreading it along banks, beaches, and eddies. The resulting sandbars create sheltered backwaters vital for native fish, giving young fish safe areas to grow. Sediment redistribution also suppresses invasive plants, such as tamarisk and camelthorn, while encouraging native vegetation to take root on new sandbars, stabilizing shorelines, and improving habitat quality. Timing is equally critical for cultural preservation. Sand protects archaeological sites along the canyon from exposure and erosion. Controlled floods that rebuild protective sand layers help preserve these irreplaceable cultural resources. However, this delicate rhythm faces mounting challenges. Climate change, long-term drought, and increasing water demand reduce both sediment availability and the water needed for high-flow experiments. Managers must constantly balance ecosystem health, cultural protection, water consumption, and hydropower production, illustrating just how intricate and vital the timing of sand and water has become. The lessons learned here underscore how restoration depends not just on the quantity of water released, but on respecting the intricate dance between water and earth beneath the surface. Archaeological and cultural impact. The Colorado River carries more than water and sediment. It carries the memory of the ancient peoples who lived along its banks for thousands of years. Throughout the Grand Canyon's river corridor lie archaeological sites dating back as far as 9,000 years, including stone dwellings, ancient trails, irrigation ditches, campgrounds, and quarry sites. Petroglyphs, pictographs, cooking pits, and tool-making areas reveal how early communities adapted to and thrived within this rugged landscape. Many of these cultural sites lie directly within or near the riverbed, historically protected by layers of sand deposited during natural floods. This sediment acted as a buffer, shielding delicate structures from erosion. As modern water management has reduced the frequency of high natural floods, sediment no longer replenishes these protective layers. Without this natural armor, sites are increasingly exposed to wind, water, and weathering that threaten to destroy artifacts that have endured for millennia. Much of the canyon's archaeological record reflects the lives of ancestors of modern Native American tribes, such as the Pueblo peoples. Their farming systems, tools, and dwellings were closely tied to the river's seasonal rhythms. Natural floods delivered the moisture and sediment that made agriculture possible and shaped the land they relied on. Today, the survival of these cultural landscapes depends heavily on the river's remaining sediment flows, linking archaeological preservation directly to ecological management. Controlled floods, intended to create new sandbars and beaches, are no longer merely environmental solutions, but are now very much necessary actions for cultural preservation. Every sandbar rebuilt takes away a little bit of the erosion that would have destroyed the ancient site, thereby uplifting the river as a keeper of heritage. This cultural aspect, in turn, makes dam management, water releases, and sediment restoration discussions heavier. Major dams have been built to facilitate the rushing waters of erosion. Sediments are left behind in the water trapped upstream, while winds continue to strip the archaeological sites that the water exposes, ruins being buried in the dust, blown away from the surface. Archaeologists sound the alarm that unless sediment deposition becomes more efficient, many sites will not be around in the next few decades, thus making the streams of human history in the Southwest disappear without any chance of reopening the chapters. The ancestral communities linked to the Colorado River have raised persistent concerns about these losses. For them, safeguarding the cultural sites is an essential part of the river's ecological restoration. Their connection to the land and water is so pronounced that the requirement for sediment restoration goes beyond an environmental matter to one of culture and ethics. The effect is felt not only in the scientific and tribal heritage areas, but also in the areas of tourism and the general public perception of the canyon. The Grand Canyon receives millions of visitors annually, in part because of the cultural tales the place tells. The shrinking of the erosion area also shrinks the sharing of the indigenous history and the teaching of future generations. The water policy that was initially adopted for modern growth has ironically endangered ancient legacies, thus making it harder to strike a balance between the needs of the present and the respect of the region's first inhabitants. The human stories etched along the riverbanks are deeply entwined with the practical and political realities of water management that follow next, balancing power and nature. The Glen Canyon Dam is a remarkable feat of engineering, supplying hydroelectric power to millions across several states. Yet the very water that generates electricity also shapes the fate of the ecosystems and cultures downstream. Each time dam operators release water to mimic natural floods, they face a difficult trade-off between ecological restoration and power production. The more water bypasses turbines during these controlled floods, the less electricity is generated, impacting energy providers and consumers. These high-flow experiments, while vital for the river's health, come with significant financial costs. The first deliberate flood in 1996, for example, resulted in an estimated loss of around $1.8 million in revenue, about 1% of the dam's annual income. Adding research and monitoring expenses nearly doubled the cost. For power companies and local governments relying on this revenue, frequent floods represent a substantial economic burden. Moreover, government agencies managing the dam have imposed strict limits on how much water can be released without compromising the system's stability. Releases that exceed 235,000 gallons per second can only last about 96 hours, since longer or larger floods would reduce power generation too severely. These constraints make scheduling and designing flood events a constant balancing act under rigid technical and financial boundaries. The stakes are further raised by regional power needs. When the dam produces less electricity, states sometimes have to turn to fossil fuels like coal and natural gas to fill the gap, conflicting with environmental goals. This means efforts to help the river's ecology can unintentionally increase greenhouse gas emissions. A paradox emerges where saving water habitats can, at times, strain clean energy ambitions. Despite the challenges, many energy managers recognize the value of periodic floods for sustaining the river's overall health. The goal has shifted from maintaining a static power output towards flexible management that accommodates controlled floods when sediment conditions are right. This shift reflects the growing understanding that the river's vibrant ecology underpins tourism, fisheries, and cultural heritage. All valuable to regional economies, engineers continually explore ways to optimize the dam's operation. Advances in turbine technology, real-time monitoring, and predictive modeling help find compromises that protect power generation while allowing ecological releases. Water managers negotiate with environmental experts, indigenous representatives, and politicians to craft agreements that balance diverse interests. Still, the central challenge remains. Water is a limited resource that must serve many masters. Hydropower demands agricultural irrigation, urban consumption, recreational uses, and habitat restoration compete fiercely. In times of drought, these pressures become nearly impossible to satisfy simultaneously, underscoring the urgent need for sustainable water policies. The effort to balance power and nature is not just technical, but deeply human, requiring dialogue, compromise, and a long-term vision for coexistence in a changing world. The future of the Colorado River. The Colorado River's future sits on a knife edge, strained by rising demand and a climate delivering less water than ever. More than 40 million people across 7 U.S. states rely on it for drinking water, farming, power, and recreation. Yet the river is governed by century-old agreements crafted for a region with far fewer people and a very different landscape. The Southwest is now in a near-permanent drought. Scientists call it the worst in at least 1,200 years. Warmer temperatures and shrinking Rocky Mountain snowpack mean less runoff to refill rivers and reservoirs. Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the system's key storage hubs, have plunged to record lows, threatening both water supply and hydropower. As flows decline, communities face difficult choices. Cities, farmers, industries, and indigenous nations all compete for shrinking allocations. Agriculture uses the largest share, heightening tension as water becomes scarce. Many Native American tribes, despite holding senior rights, continue to push for fair access that honors their cultural and ecological ties to the river-urban areas, meanwhile confront more frequent restrictions as they try to secure reliable supplies. Climate change has become a major contributor to the uncertainty. Traditional planning models are no longer reliable due to reduced precipitation and extended periods of heat. The environmental flows, which refer to the water remaining in the river for the sake of the aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, fish, riparian plants, and wildlife, are usually the first ones to be taken away. This, in turn, creates serious problems for the ecosystems and biodiversity across the river corridor. In the present day, the focus of the solutions is more on conservation and efficiency, water reuse, drought-resistant crops, patching up leaking infrastructure, and climate-smart landscaping. Besides, certain areas are also experimenting with non-traditional sources such as treated wastewater or limited desalination. However, these options involve the commitment of a lot of money and collaboration for periods to come before they can be made available on a large scale. The recent deals point toward a strong readiness to change, such as releasing water at the highest rate for sandbars and habitat restoration as an experiment. To have significant changes, though, it needs the support of the politicians and cooperation between the states. The Colorado River is, on the one hand, a natural source and a cultural support. On the other, its future is tied to the renewal of the old systems, the acceptance of conservation, and the water management with the ecosystem's perspective. Otherwise, this legendary river will just be a thing of the past. The Colorado River's journey reveals a profound lesson. Nature's rhythms, once disrupted, are difficult to restore, but not impossible to respect. From dry riverbeds awakening to the delicate dance of water, sediment, and culture, the river's survival hinges on a balance between human needs and ecological health. If you found this story eye-opening, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. And if you're ready to keep exploring, go ahead and follow the next video waiting for you on screen.